Well, the Environmental Protection Agency announced earlier this week new regulations seeking a 30% reduction of carbon emissions at coal-fired power plants by the year 2030. The regulations have been described as the U.S. government's most sweeping effort aimed at curbing the emissions that cause global warming.
However, The Guardian reports some of the most coal-heavy states, including West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, will be allowed to maintain or even increase their emissions under the EPA plan. Meanwhile, the European Union and the United States must, quote, do even more to help keep global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius. For more, we go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Janet Redman, director of the Climate Policy Program at the Institute for Policy Studies. She recently co-released a statement with Winona Howder called EPA's carbon rule falls short of real emissions reduction. Janet Redman, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what President Obama announced, what the EPA announced last weekend, and what it means.
Sure. I think what's important to keep in mind is there are kind of three pieces to this. This is an exciting and important announcement. But it falls short of real leadership on climate change, and there are a lot of devils in the details that we still need to figure out in the next year. So first and foremost, this is an incredibly important announcement. This is the first time that the White House, that the U.S. is looking at reducing greenhouse gas pollution from power plants. That's based on a finding from 2009 that when the EPA determined that greenhouse gas emissions do threaten the well-being of Americans because they lead to climate change, which has negative impacts on families and on our environment. So this is an incredibly important announcement. And it's important in particular because climate change is really an environmental justice issue. The impacts of climate change and the impacts of pollution that come from power plants hurt people who are living in communities of color and low-income communities first and worst. So that's an incredibly important win. The problem, however, is that those reductions are not enough to make the U.S. a leader, either here at home or on the global stage. So let's look at the numbers a little bit. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body of hundreds of scientists from around the world who study climate change, who read thousands of reports and put out their own global assessment every few years, have said that developed countries like the United States need to reduce their economy-wide emissions between 25% and 40% from 1990 levels by 2020. Now, when we look at Obama and EPA's plan, they're talking about reducing emissions from only the power generating sector. So that's only about 40% of our economy. And they're talking about reducing those emissions from the year 2005. Our emissions were much higher in 2005 than in 1990 levels. So we're already creating a kind of a false baseline and measuring our reductions differently than other folks in other countries are measuring them. So 30% reduction in only a relatively an important but small part of our economy-wide emissions from a higher baseline and by a later year means that we're not making the kinds of emission reductions that we need to stay below 2 degrees of warming from pre-industrial levels to avoid catastrophic climate change.
And Janet Redman, on the environmental justice aspect of this, there's also this issue of the allowance of cap and trade as a means perhaps where some communities will not be able to benefit from these reductions. Could you talk about that?
Sure. This is where the kind of the devil in the detail piece comes in. What the EPA's plan does, instead of saying, listen, we're going to have an emission reduction plan that's the same for every single state, this EPA plan says the states will set targets for each state, and the targets are different for every state. As you mentioned, some of the most polluting states have actually lower targets or, in fact, may not have to reduce their emissions at all. But there are many different ways that states can meet their emission reductions if they have them. Things like renewable energy portfolio standards, demand-side energy efficiency. California, for example, has fuel emission standards. But there's also a mechanism called cap and trade, where a cap is placed on greenhouse gas emissions. We like that part. The cap's important. But polluters are allowed to trade emissions permits, pollution permits that allow them to meet their regulatory obligations in the cheapest way possible. That's a problem because while the atmosphere may not care where greenhouse gas emissions come from, the people who live in the shadow of most polluting and dirtiest industries, the ones where it will be most expensive to clean up and are most likely to use cheaper mechanisms like buying credits, will still be breathing in the toxic emissions of those power plants. But even more importantly, I think this is where we're really concerned about what happens over the next year while states are writing their plans and the EPA are reviewing those plans from states. There's a problem called offsetting. In the EPA's plan, it says it will not accept offsets from outside of the power sector. So, for example, it won't say, if you protect some forest over here, that's going to count the same as lowering your emissions from a power plant. However, the state plans do accept out-of-sector offsets. So it will be on the states themselves to say to the EPA, hey, we've got these out-of-sector emissions reductions, so we're paying farmers to reduce their emissions from, say, methane from manure, and we're counting those as our own while our own power plants continue to emit or emit more. We're going to figure out a way to have those not count when we report to you at the federal level. I think even the EPA knows that that's going to be incredibly complicated. So the plans over the next year are incredibly important. The problem is, once the plans are approved by the EPA, it's a hands-off approach. So we'll have to wait about a decade to see if, in fact, states were able to take apart the various offsets inside their cap-and-trade program to make sure that, in fact, power plants in states like California are really, in fact, reducing their emissions.
Republican House Speaker John Boehner criticized Obama's plan, saying it would, quote, cause a surge in electricity bills, shut down plants, and potentially put an average of 224,000 more people out of work every year. He also said he's not qualified, really, to talk about climate change. He says, I'm not qualified to debate the science over climate change. Your thoughts on this very quickly in 10 seconds, Janet.
Certainly. I think what's important is that reducing emissions and reining in pollution from coal power plants and augmenting renewable energy and energy efficiency actually will create jobs. It will reduce costs that we spend right now on caring for asthma, on caring for days missed when parents have to take kids to the hospital to treat asthma. It's better for our economy. It's better for our communities to reduce pollution from power plants. We should be doing a better job than we are. We should be doing a better job than the EPA's plan.
We have to